Hey, sovereign wealth builders. Welcome to part 3 this week in geopolitics of Simon Dixon Hard Talk Live. In part 3, we're going to be going through the operations and how to read them correctly that I believe is happening in Iran, Yemen, and Venezuela, and the truth behind these so-called quote-unquote regime changes that are happening right now. There is massive action. I wanted to go into Somalia, various other things. I'll touch upon them briefly, but I want to just go through the map right now and help people make sense of it. In part 1, I covered the technical, the technical flows that are happening in the currency wars. In part 2, I discussed the macro side and the coordination that's happening between transnational capital, Chinese money buying oil, which is propping up Gulf sovereign wealth funds, that's purchasing US assets, and now the US military is being used to take assets which are being gobbled up into the financial industrial complex while they deploy a surveillance state using the technical industrial complex. That's the world order that's being set up, and Venezuela needed to contribute to that operation. Iran needed to contribute to that. And we can look at what happened in Yemen to understand what's really happening in the Middle East as well. So let me just give you some underlying asset. I've been consolidating my analysis with the middle nation analysis that I covered into around like this new flow of money, as well as Evan Writes on X, an account where I consolidate my financial flows with those analysis. And we agree, we're in line in terms of what's actually happening here. So the Middle East is essentially going to be used, I believe, as a conduit between US as a regional power and China leading BRICS. And Middle East is going to be a tax-neutral jurisdiction that is able to host some of these data centers, repurpose some of its energy, and use its influence in acquiring US assets to get the technical industrial complex to build data centers, not only in America, but also in the Middle East, while China's building its data centers as we move to this AI robotics world that's going to power these stablecoin central bank digital currencies. Countries are going to build resistance through Bitcoin sovereign wealth and repurposing some of that energy into Bitcoin mining, while we transition to this multipolarity, and any negotiations are being resolved through currency wars and gold negotiations and Bitcoin negotiations as a rising asset as it becomes more and more influential as an asset class. So with that in mind, let's look at the geopolitical consequences for that. What is happening in the Middle East is that the Gulf that used to be plagued by the US stock market being propped up by forever war and military revenue, $10 trillion of debt was created for all of these wars across Afghanistan, across Iraq, across all of the different proxies, against covert operations through NATO to co-opt Turkey into NATO, partnering with Qatar, having all these military bases, funding covert operations and proxies via Qatar, that went to Hamas, various other structures, using Israel in order to build alternative structures, militias like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, covert operations to justify all of this civil unrest, manufactured unrest, Iran-Contra affairs, where Iran, after the revolution, was partnering with the US over destabilizing between Iran and Saudi and Iraq onto those wars. Using these illegal weapons trafficking operations, laundering it through the Vatican Bank in Operation Gladio, that going back to Central and South America, propping up the drug cartels, allowing the Afghan drugs to replace a version of the Taliban that was resisting the drugs with a version of the Taliban that was allowing the drugs to get to the CIA, get them into America. And all these covert operations that I've covered with declassified CIA documents and Operation Gladio and various other things, all of those constructs are coming to an end. I've always said to get peace in the Middle East, you need the US to give up all their proxies. You need Iran and Saudi Arabia to have the incentive to give up strategic escalation and tension between the, strategic tension between Iran and Israel that creates all this profits for the US military industrial complex, but never leads to a chaotic war that destabilizes the allies in the region that have now got their sovereign wealth. And in order to achieve all of that, you need to resolve the Palestinian cause. And so the Palestinian cause now has this plan that they called the Trump plan, but it was essentially the Gulf plan, with regional powers. Trump was bribed through affinity capital. He gets to get rich, build Trump towers, and he's cooperating. And Israel has been dumped by the military-industrial complex. So when you had the 12-day war, it created massive debt. The debt to GDP in Israel went from 60% to 70%. UAE acquiring various assets, strategic choke points, and dependency upon oil flows between Egypt and Israel. And the privatization program continuing, where the Israeli stock market gets pushed more and more into private programs. More and more of the national assets get privatized. And you have essentially a subordination campaign, an asset stripping campaign in Israel, just like is happening in America and the collective West. You create the K-shaped economy that leads to civil unrest. Now you get regime change in both, operations in Israel and Iran. But the regime change within Iran is internal, because the regime will remain, but it will get rid of the hardliners and shed the proxies. Netanyahu negotiates his exit and utility, dumped by military, but he uses the military in order to acquire as much land, expand settlements and various other things, so that the financial industrial complex and the Gulf countries can end up controlling the region based upon a coordinated negotiation, because China's buying all of the oil that funds the operations and the sovereign wealth fund. And that creates that transnational capital that I talked about. So the Gulf continues to quietly seize control over the Red Sea choke points that were previously up to US and via its proxies to control. And so the US is exiting strategically the Middle East. Those military bases, as Middle Eastern power rises, will be used for simply defense contracts. So now Qatar is negotiating defense contracts direct. Saudi, when it was announced, is negotiating defense alliances with Pakistan, who's a nuclear power, and Turkey, who's a military power, and Egypt, who's a military power. And so while Saudi is buying those military defense contracts, is building its own regional hedge, which removes the need for Israel, because Israel was a destabilization campaign to create war so that you could perpetuate the forever war. And so now we're moving to more and more agreements, more and more announcements, more and more cooperation. But at the same time, the theater is showing that it's like we're about to move to World War III. Israel rules the world. They're going to get the Greater Israel Project. They're going to be the new superpower. So the American MIC gets to kind of say to its people, hey, guess what? All of that genocide and everything that's happening, that wasn't us. That was Israel. And so narrative is being controlled in order to perpetuate that. But in the meantime, you're seeing that as the American military industrial complex has become a rental militia to seize assets for transnational capital, China GCC financial industrial complex, global in nature, we're seeing that Israel has switched its role because Netanyahu needs to provide its utility to transnational capital. And so you're starting to see very, very different actions. And so what looks like the Greater Israel Project is going to end up acquiring land for Gulf control, regional stability, and negotiated outcomes based upon power dynamics. So we had escalation in Yemen. Yemen's been one of humanitarian crisis, war zone for a long time. You know, proxies funded, UAE interest, Saudi interest, Iranian interest. And now, you know, Houthis that were previously aligned with Iranian interest, we're seeing that Iran's no longer supporting. And so we had massive escalation and coordinated theater that looked like UAE and Saudi were about to go into war. And there was all these narratives that Saudi's taking on UAE, when really they're negotiating over the future of Yemen. And Yemen, its war will end with Saudi essentially controlling most of the region and negotiating with the Houthis, because Iran, behind the scenes, is aligned through their normalization agreement and their dependency upon China, because China can control the game by deciding not to purchase oil or purchase oil. So when those currency war happens, Iran has to comply. China wants de-dollarization and these networks to go through. Therefore, you shed the proxies and you go for regional stability. So I think Houthis are now genuinely serving their own interests, that will be negotiating with Saudi, and they will be integrated or eliminated depending upon the power dynamics. Iran is no longer backing them. That's what the monetary flows are saying anyway, and the results. And that's why, you know, Iran seems to be complying with the network. Now, why did that happen? What did the UAE get from that? Well, they were negotiating regional territories. And so you had this escalation in Somaliland, which also coordinated with exposing fraud in Minnesota. So you got the destabilization campaign in America based upon exposing fraud, which happens everywhere, but you focus on the Somalians. Then suddenly you had Israel recognizing Somaliland in Somalia. Somalia, this separatist movement, Somaliland is mainly UAE-controlled assets and ports. So why is Israel recognizing it? Now, everyone said, and Israeli media pushed out a story saying Israel rules the world and we're going to put all the Palestinians and ethnically cleanse them into Somaliland. Everyone was freaking out thinking that it's going to happen. UAE is in charge there. Why would they want, you know, ethnically cleansed Palestinians in a port that's strategically important that would be resisting and enemies of Israel? That makes zero sense, but people don't think about it because they got the power dynamics wrong. So Israel is suddenly now acting as a proxy for UAE interest when everyone thinks that UAE works for Israel. But UAE, you know, Israel doesn't get anything out of this. They're being used as their superior military, recognizing Somaliland, which helps UAE. And then everyone else is going down around and saying, hey, UAE is doing all the Zionist bidding. Why? Because they're pushing out narratives like, hey, Muslim Brotherhood is taking over the UK. What does that do? Well, in UK, they want to crash the real estate market. New tax has come in. And think about this. This is so ironic. A narrative is pushed out with social media that UK is weakening because of a Muslim invasion. There's massive immigration and demographic changes. Don't get me wrong. These are operations. But only 6% are Muslims. So UAE is pushing out a narrative that Muslim Brotherhood is implementing Sharia law in the UK. Muslim Brotherhood at the highest level represents proxy power for Western powers. So UAE is saying, you know, classify Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. America does it. You get to push the civil unrest campaign in America. You get to push out a narrative. And what are all the, while these new tax laws happening in UK that's making everyone want to sell their property, sell their real estate, and they're being taxed on their global wealth. What are all the millionaires and billionaires in UK doing? They're all leaving. There's an exodus outside of the UK from everyone that has wealth. Where are they going? Dubai. Think about this. We're being told that there's a Muslim invasion in UK. The UAE is saying that you need to sanction Muslim Brotherhood. All the rich billionaires and millionaires are looking to save their global wealth, and they're fleeing to a Muslim country because there's so much crime in the UK, there's so much surveillance in the UK. They're basically playing immigration policy while the rich and wealthy end up in a Muslim country anyway. And Dubai and UAE is creating a hub just for Westerners that has all the degeneracy that's pumping the sovereign wealth fund based upon these trades and routes that are happening. It's so ironic when you really follow the money. It's the exact opposite of what the media is doing. So they're creating a destabilization campaign in the UK while they're taking all the millionaires and billionaires into tax neutral jurisdiction. And they're using Muslim narrative in order to get there, while simultaneously running a Jews rule the world or Israel rules the world campaign that is creating all of this civil unrest, surveillance state, and ushering in the subordination as well. So anyway, it's just quite remarkable when you look at these big trends as well. So Somaliland emerges as basically a Gulf front end. Now you've got control by UAE and the Gulf Cooperation Council over two strategic ports within the Red Sea that connect to Egypt in the Suez Canal. This is the exit of America from the most strategic routes. Now, Iran has the Strait of Hormuz. So you need Iran to cooperate with the Gulf countries that China is 100% dependent upon. This is the exit of America while trying to look strong and handing over those regions to the recognized regional powers while using Israel as a proxy to get as much land so that they can negotiate better terms when the financial industrial complex invests in all these different regions, these different areas to get the energy and to get the AI and everything that's needed. So Israel has now become a UAE proxy while everyone thinks that UAE is a proxy for Israel right now when you follow the money. The Palestinians won't be ethnically cleansed. They'll stay exactly where they are. It's disgusting what happened. They leveled the whole thing so it can be rebuilt. The Affinity Capital, which is Trump's funds funded by the sovereign wealth funds, have bribed Trump to get Palestinian recognized. Qatar, Saudi built all their European relationships. That led to all of those European countries recognizing Palestine. Trump put together the plan. He's bribed through profits. And the Israeli land that is being pushed will end up controlled by the Gulf countries and controlled by Regional Stability GCC plan. This is the game that the money is saying is happening. Now, the UAE exits Yemen in a very dramatical form. It looks like chaos. Everyone was saying that they were at war with each other. Meanwhile, Saudi and UAE are negotiating. You get your power in Somaliland. Turkey gets its power in Somalia. We get our power in Yemen. And we create a very balanced GCC, Regional Stability Alliance, to take over the ports and the regions now that America is exiting. And it's all propped up by China buying oil. So what did China do? It has built the largest oil reserves in the world. If while China and transnational capital and the Gulf countries are taking the oil using the US military industrial complex in Venezuela, that Chevron and Exxon can't do because they say, even Exxon came out and said, we can't invest that amount. you're getting control of the different ports, and China can crash the price of oil if it wants by releasing its ginormous oil reserves that has been used by sharing its wealth and getting these infrastructure contracts. You see how this is all flowing together right now? It was essentially Saudi and UAE trading these different areas and leading to a regional stability GCC structure as well. So Israel is going to be conceived through vassalization, and it's changed its role, working for the FIC instead of the MIC now. And it works for GCC powers while representing in the negotiation phase Western FIC powers as well. Now, Israel doesn't dominate Trump anymore, because what happens now, the narrative is that Netanyahu controls Trump. That's what every social media and narrative will say. Now, he's gone over like 5 or 6 times. You don't go over to the White House when it's very hard to travel for Netanyahu. He's a war criminal. There's jurisdictions that will have to arrest him. It's very tricky. There's less and less countries he can travel over. So it's harder and harder for him to get to the White House. But you don't go to the White House unless there's problems. That's Trump not doing what he agreed with Netanyahu he would do. And so therefore Netanyahu needs to come back and say, why aren't you doing this? And then they agree, and then we're getting this whole thing, and he keeps having to come back. Why? Because Trump is primed by Gulf power, which is investing in regional stability, and the previous dynamic has completely changed. Because Trump is mainly aligned with BlackRock and the financial industrial complex. And so, I think we're witnessing more and more of that. And so that model of US military industrial complex being a militia for other powers is playing out. And I think we're just going to see coordinated operations rather than destabilizations, genocide, ethnic cleansing operations. Now we're just going to see coordinated operations in order to, eliminate proxies or integrate proxies as well, which is why we're seeing a little bit more in Lebanon and various other things. I think Iran has already accepted the Gulf terms. I think it's already been strategically decided that there would be an operation within Iran that would lead to the shedding of any IRGC hardliners that weren't on board with the plan. That's being done internally. I think Khamenei remains. There was a regime change already. The Reform Party was installed in Iran. A helicopter had to come down. I think that was an inside job because no one talked about it. Normally, if it was Israel, they would turn that into a color revolution and an opportunity, and there'll be loads of press about it. When it's an inside job, it's a bit more quiet because the region had probably agreed. And so all of the proxies, they need to be eliminated or integrated. And I think we're witnessing that one by one. They're no longer disruptors because everyone's agreed on the plan. And that's why when you saw it in Syria, Assad wasn't regime change through a genuine uprising by rebels. And that's why you got to look at the Iran operation right now. The Iran operation, people can't change the regime. They have to get the military to work with them and side with them to change the regime. The reason that Assad left Syria is because the rebels, the revolution, was joined by the army, and the army stepped down, and Assad and Russia and China and Iran and Turkey and the Gulf powers and American factions of power had all agreed that he would go into exile in China. So this is what I think we saw with Maduro. This is what I think we saw with Assad. This is what I think we're seeing. And now I don't think it's going to be a regime change because I think Khamenei is on board, and you need the theatrics in order to get the transition and everybody maintain their narrative that they need. But I believe what's happening in Iran right now is a shedding of IRGC and Mossad assets that aren't on board with the region. There's lots of Mossad assets that are creating, these shootings and civil unrest and sharing things. I think in the internet blackout, they're going. But at the same time, there's that campaign of they're all being killed and it's the protesters that are being killed. No one can know that, but just follow the money and it makes sense. Yeah, so China can essentially control the price of oil with OPEC if anyone gets out of line. If you need Iran to comply, you stop buying a bit more of its oil. But how else does it make sense that the oil still flows and China's able to buy it, other than there's this new transnational capital allegiance and this whole thing between China and America and various other things? The factions of power have been determined, and there is a coordinated transition, and it's not World War III, despite everyone thinking this is a movement towards World War III. This is a US retreat into a regional power, and everyone deciding that they don't want to go to World War III. The proof of weapons network is going to have more and more power in the West, more and more subordination. And the MIC is going to step aside in the Middle East and hand over to the FIC, which means reallocate capital towards the Gulf countries, co-invest in deals, and you're seeing all those co-investments everywhere. They would not be happening if they knew that there's about to be a ginormous regional war, because that would take out all of that money. But if they make it look like there's about to be a massive regional war, they get the best terms and they can front run all the deals. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. And eventually Israel will be left behind in this as well. So they'll have to get on with their neighbors. The role has changed. And that's what I think is happening. Almost everyone disagrees with me. And yet when I'm on these spaces, it seems to move in that direction. But anyway. So I think that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're going to lead the GCC. I think they're on board in cooperation with both Iran and Turkey. And China's going to create peace in the Middle East, and Trump takes credit from it and gets to profit from it. And then maybe he gets his Nobel Peace Prize next year because it had to be handed to the CIA implant, USAID funded opposition in Venezuela that is currently meeting with Trump at the White House, while the whole infrastructure of the government remains. And remember, Venezuela is not getting, the Venezuelan people aren't going to get any of the oil. But Palestine will exist. It has to exist. It will be Gulf controlled, and Israel will be acquired as well. Who's the country that can do that? UAE and Saudi playing good cop, bad cop. And that's what you're seeing right now. UAE is able to invest in Israel because it's in the Abraham Accords. Saudi holds out. And eventually you have a crescendo of all these deals that are negotiated, and an alternative to World War III. EU is vassalized further. That's what I think we're witnessing right now. That's the new world order. That's the transition that we're headed to. So what I want to do in the final section is just, I want to make sure that you're smart. So many people will say, Simon, you're such a conspiracy theorist. Well, the reason I come up with these theories is because I follow money. I look at WikiLeaks documents that are leaked from those on the inside. And I look at previous operations of declassified documents. And what I want to do right now is I want to show you, I want to play a video from what happened in Venezuela previously, so that when you see what's happening today, you ask yourself, so we know that that's what happened previously. So is it really a conspiracy theory if identical patterns are happening today? And so what I want to do right now is, Azad, if you could play the first, it's a 5-minute AI summary that I created from going through some of the documents that I've read around declassified documents, CIA, and some videos that explain the situation and the history in Venezuela well, so that you can say, well, is it really outlandish that the same thing that happened in the past that we've got evidence for is happening today, and Simon's not just a cookie crazy conspiracy theorist? So let's play the first video, Azad, which is the AI whiteboard summary on Venezuela.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down a source from Propaganda & Co. that poses a really critical question. You see this U.S. military buildup near Venezuela, right? Is it a genuine show of strength? Or is it something else? A desperate move from an empire that feels like it's losing its grip? Let's get right into it.
You know, according to the source we're digging into, this age-old piece of wisdom from Sun Tzu is absolutely key. It's the lens through which we need to view what's happening right now with the U.S. military off the coast of Venezuela.
And think about it, right? The source argues this is all about perception. You've got these huge challenges from China, major setbacks in Ukraine, and the US dollar itself is starting to look a little shaky. So this feeling of weakness, it's not just an international thing. It's being felt right at home. The argument here is that this whole military show is basically an attempt to flip the script. But what if it's more than just posturing? What if this is a genuine, high-stakes, do-or-die moment for an empire? To really get to the bottom of this, we've got to go back. Way back. We need to look at the deep-seated historical conflict between these two countries. And believe me, this story goes back a long, long time. The whole thing really starts with this massive clash of ideas. Two completely opposite visions for what the Western Hemisphere should even be. So on one hand, you've got Simón Bolívar's dream, right? A united, sovereign South America, totally free from outside meddling. But then you have the Monroe Doctrine from the US, which, let's be honest, basically said, hey, this entire half of the planet, it belongs to us. I mean, these two visions were on a collision course from the very beginning. And smack dab in the middle of this huge ideological fight sits an absolutely mind-boggling prize. We're talking $18 trillion. That's the estimated value of Venezuela's proven oil reserves, the largest on Earth. That much money, that much power, it changes the entire game. You'd think all that oil money would be a blessing, right? Well, for most of the 20th century, it was anything but for the actual people of Venezuela. It just created this vicious cycle, what a lot of people call the curse of oil. So let's walk through how this all went down. In the 70s, you have this massive oil boom. Prices are through the roof, but the money mostly goes to a tiny elite. Then the 80s hit and oil prices totally collapse. Now Venezuela is drowning in debt. It gets so bad that by the late 80s, something like 70% of the people are in poverty. The whole thing just exploded in 1989 with a huge and very deadly uprising called El Caracazo. Okay, so the government's back is against the wall. They go to the IMF for loans. But those loans came with some really tough strings attached. The main one? Austerity. And what that means is the government has to slash spending on things people rely on. Public services, subsidies for food and fuel. It's a brutal pill to swallow. So, into this mess, this chaos and popular anger, steps a military officer named Hugo Chavez. And he's not talking about little tweaks or small reforms. Nope. He's promising a complete and total revolution. And he really meant it. First step, he nationalizes the oil industry. He takes those oil profits and plows them back into things like healthcare, housing, and education for the people. And this was all part of a much bigger plan to bring back Bolivar's dream and finally break free from the US-led economic order. Now, you have to understand, from Washington's point of view, this was way more than just a disobedient little country. This was a direct threat to the entire American imperial strategy. It was a threat to the petrodollar, a threat to US geopolitical dominance, everything. The source argues that from that point on, a major conflict was pretty much guaranteed. All right, this next part is absolutely crucial. The source we're looking at says the fight we're seeing right now, it's not just about the oil. It's about the money used to buy the oil. So for decades, one of the biggest pillars of American global power has been this thing called the petrodollar system. It's pretty simple. If you want to buy oil on the global market, you have to use US dollars. This gives the US a massive, massive financial advantage. The thing is, that system is starting to come apart at the seams. You've got the BRICS nations, we're talking China, Russia, and others, and they're actively building a whole alternative financial system. And it's working. We're now seeing huge oil deals being done in other currencies, especially the Chinese yuan. Every one of those deals chips away at the foundation of the dollar's power. And this is where Venezuela really crossed a red line in Washington's eyes. They started building very close ties with America's main rivals, China, Russia, and Iran. Suddenly, Venezuela isn't just a nuisance anymore. It's a strategic beachhead for America's enemies right in its own backyard. Which brings us to the endgame, what the source calls the empire's do or die moment. This whole situation brings us right back to the present day. And the argument here is that the US isn't just showing off. It's literally defending the core operating system of its entire global empire.
And a central player in this whole endgame is the opposition figure Maria Corina Machado. She's been recognized by the U.S. as Venezuela's legitimate leader. And really, her own words say a lot. She's quoted as saying, "We will open Venezuela for foreign investment, a transparent, massive privatization program that is waiting for you." I mean, it doesn't get much clearer than that, does it? The promise is to open up all that oil, gas, and gold to foreign companies.
And make no mistake, this isn't just talk or political games. The military threat is absolutely real. The U.S. recently moved its largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, into the area. There's a no-fly zone in effect. I mean, all the pieces are being put on the board for a potential military conflict.
So what's the bottom line here? According to the source we've been breaking down, this is so much more than just another regional conflict. This is a showdown over who gets to control the oil that will shape the next century. It's a battle that could very well decide who the next global superpower is. And the biggest question of all is, who's going to win?
Okay, thank you for bearing with us through getting that one played. I hope you think it was worth it. Right, so that was recorded. We did that right before the actual kidnapping operation happened. And during the kidnapping operation, you know, I think it became really clear that this has got nothing to do with drugs, nothing to do with saving the Venezuelan people. And so who really benefited from this? Well, in order to figure that one out, we've got to follow the money, as always. So what was the immediate impact after the kidnapping happened? Well, the Venezuelan stock market pumped almost 300%. So who benefits from the Venezuelan stock market? Well, let's think about this. Let's look at the ownership structure of Venezuelan stock market stocks. So obviously it's a sanctioned country. The sanctions were implemented to allow Chevron to sell oil to China and make sure that the Venezuelan people didn't get any of the benefit by sanctioning the US government. But obviously that involves corrupt flows as well. So you go from Chevron through to Maduro, through to China, and sanctions are weaponized in order to make sure that China gets the best price for that oil, is the end result. So much of the ownership of the Venezuelan stock exchange, which is called BVC, I'm not going to say it in Spanish, it's completely held by local banks, a few financial institutions, and a very small number of very wealthy domestic investors. So if it was known that the stock market is going to pump like crazy, the Venezuelan stock market, surely there would be some kind of incentive by the Venezuelan banks, the wealthy institutions, and the insiders. Now, I don't know exactly who they are, but my guess is that very few people in Venezuelans own shares in the public float of the stock market, which is why it pumps so far, because the liquidity is very down, is very low. But if you're Maduro, do you reckon he might have some kind of trust structure where he has a bunch of stocks in the Venezuelan stock exchange? Maybe, just maybe, Maduro agreed to have some theatrics. Would it be out of the question that this wasn't this administration, but maybe Maduro and his wife had already negotiated exactly how this would happen? And he's going to be fine, and he's going to get a lot of money. And America gets to push out a brochure there of how amazing their military is and their operations, which they're clearly renting to transnational capital in order to acquire assets for corporate interests. Because there's no American sovereign wealth fund. There's no Venezuelan sovereign wealth fund. The money's not going. The revenue's not saying we're going to help the Venezuelan people and the American people. The American people, they pay the bill. And so who's actually getting the benefit from this? Well, if you look at the sanctions, China was already buying Venezuelan oil from the US, and it was from Chevron and it was at a deep discount, and it was perfectly allowed by the US government. In fact, the sanctions gave carve out to Chevron in order to sell it to China at a deep discount. Now, Trump has already approved for this to continue. So it's not about choking China. China's getting some nice oil, but it is being controlled by the US government. Before, it was being controlled by covert operations. So is this really about choking off China's oil supply, which is kind of, you go through layers of propaganda. At the highest layer, you think this is about drugs and saving the Venezuelan people, which is the narrative. But then you clearly understand that this is about empire and dollar and oil. But then when you actually follow the money, you realize this doesn't strengthen the dollar because there's an operation to weaken the dollar. And it doesn't strengthen the American power with China. So why could this possibly be happening? Because, it's not choking off the supply. So you look before the operation, China was moving its oil on sea refining operations that it had invested a lot of money in order to support the refining from that. And so China was already moving in advance. You can see all the shipments. They clearly knew that this was going to happen. It wasn't a surprise. Now, was it a surprise for Maduro? Well, that's up for speculation. Maybe it was a surprise for him and everybody else colluded against him. But it's highly likely that he was part of the negotiations as well. Now, could this be part of a power structure where corrupt politicians get paid a lot of money and they have to comply with the network and they put out theatrics there that this is some kind of war, but really many of them are colluding? That's up to speculation, but I think many of the power brokers did well out of this, and clearly almost all of them knew, because when you saw the operation like the overthrow of Assad, that can only happen when all of the regional powers are on board. Sanctions had already prevented the Venezuelans from receiving any of the benefit from the oil. America said there's no way Venezuelans are allowed to benefit from this. The government can't have it. You can't have socialism, and then they'll call it communism to build up a narrative. But who benefited from it? Well, immediately there was a big stimulus. Remember, with the financial industrial complex was managing this rotation in the stock market away from AI dominance over to more balance, and then making sure that we covered in the macro section that it didn't break any of the credit markets or anything. Well, the stock market recovered from this. It was in a corrective market. Now, remember, during these fragile operations, the stock market can't go down. You have to have the stock market go up. And so you have to refinance the debt, burden the debt on the American people, and push it over to the US stock market. This stimulated the US stock market. All of the oil stocks were up. Halliburton was up. All of the different contractors that might benefit from this were up. And it reallocated some of that. It provides the justification for the reallocation of some of the US money printing that it needs to do. And so this really helped, kind of that some of the stocks that were not part of the TIC, the technical industrial complex. It helped that rebalancing. It re-stimulated the market, but went back at core infrastructure. And at the same time, you got, some revenue over to the military industrial complex. Every bomb, every warship, everything, you get to steal some more money from the American people, spend it into these Pentagon budgets, which then go over to the military industrial complex. And you had Lockheed Martin and various other ones that kind of, people were really licking their lips around how much you can get some new earnings per share, and maybe you can get some new revenue into military companies. And so the financial industrial complex did very well. But it's really interesting that Exxon came out and released a statement saying that we exited from Venezuela because it requires significant investment, and Chevron was building up oil reserves, trading at a loss, and it seems that it needs to be $80 a barrel. The price of oil right now was under $60 at the time, and now I think is about $65. And we had this pump and dump, 5% up on Iran, 5% down on Iran. We're going to bomb, we're not going to bomb. And so it requires $80 per barrel and about $200 billion of investment. It appears that Exxon, Chevron, and none of those companies are going to be putting that investment in because it's not making them revenue. Now, some would argue, well, it's the neighbor, it's Guyana. They need the oil to be flowing in Guyana, and therefore you need to have control over Venezuela to make sure that's happening. But also, one of the share prices that went up was Halliburton. Now, Halliburton was the net beneficiary of the Iraqi war. Now, remember, the goal of an American war is not to win. Your goal of the American war is to burden the debt on the American people and spend that revenue into the US stock market. And Iraqi war was hugely stimulus to the Iraqi stock market. This is a huge stimulus to the US stock market. You keep the debt flowing. You have the justification for putting it back. You create more K-shaped economy. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. But who can service this agreement? Now, if you're Halliburton and you don't end up owning the infrastructure or owning the oil, you just service it. Your job is to find the contractors that can service it. So is there really going to be a US, is there going to be a US manufacturing base that can compete with China on building this infrastructure? Well, what happened in Iraq? In Iraq, 30% of all the equity of all these oil companies ended up being owned by China, and China got all the infrastructure contracts. Halliburton managed it over to Chinese corporations because American corporations, couldn't do it. But Halliburton was getting loads of money, and you got the stimulus from it. And what was the reason for it in the first place? Because Saddam Hussein was saying that he's going to price oil in euros rather than dollars. So they came in to protect the euro, the euro dollar. They create a whole narrative around weapons of mass destruction. Are you starting to see the pattern? Now, we're going to look at, the justification for it. So once you know that everything's a lie, then all you need to do is really, am I a conspiracy theorist, or is this really provable by absolute facts at this stage? Well, where is the financing going to come from? So is the financial industrial complex going to put up the financing when it wants to really invest in AI infrastructure? It needs the money to come in, but it's not very lucrative because American companies work off a 3-month cycle. They need good numbers every 3 months, and they need annual, reports every 3 months for their reporting cycles. And so they can't do silly investments like this. But who's got a longer term cycle? Well, a country that has sovereign wealth. A country that can produce oil between $2 and $10. A country like Saudi Arabia that happens to be investing in lots of infrastructure and refiners in America. What about some of those Texas refiners in America that might get the contract? Who owns those? You're starting to see the picture here. Is it really Israel rules the world? Or is there a bigger game that's happening here? And so maybe the financing comes from the Gulf sovereign wealth funds. And someone that can actually make a loss because they can offset it by a long-term strategy that bankrupts the US companies, and they can end up acquiring them and building it into their cheaper infrastructure, because Saudi works with China to build their infrastructure, and they work with cheap immigration in order to build it as well. And they have contracts with US companies, but they killed the 50-50 split model. It's all based upon service right now. And America competes with Saudi, and Saudi's revenue primarily comes from its largest trading partner, which is China. So this is the transnational capital power structure that I keep repeating in different forms that we're seeing time and time again. So China funds the Gulf sovereign wealth funds and gets infrastructure contracts. They get to do some of that with the petro yuan rather than the petro dollar. They get to build this credit financial system. All of the different non-SWIFT based payment rails are being built. You get the India side as well that's buying oil from China. Buying oil from Russia. And you get these different flows that can de-dollarize, circumvent sanctions. The Gulf Sovereign Wealth Fund is essentially using that money to buy up US assets. Those US assets provides influence and the extraction of returns. What is the IMF? The IMF is colonization through loans, but we're doing this through equity. Equity equals partnership, which means there's no point in the forever war models. And all of a sudden, many of those investments are buying from US corporations. So they're buying from Boeing, they're buying from that. Now, Trump comes out and says, I've got $1.5 trillion of stimulus, but I'm not giving you your bonuses or your buybacks to the military companies. That corrected the share price. And suddenly it went back up again when he said, I got another $500 billion for you. He's basically saying, I cannot meet these orders. I need you to innovate faster. I need you to get more rare earth minerals from China. I need you to get more chips. I need you to innovate faster. Because China and America are not in a trade war. And tariff policy was simply renegotiation to extract wealth, hand it over from the expense of the American people, create more wealth inequality, just like COVID, and allow it to stimulate the stock market like crazy. And so Saudi gets to buy more defense contracts, which reduces the need for Israel as a destabilizing force, and they get more influence. They get to go to NVIDIA and say, can you build some of those data centers? And I've got the relationship with China in order to get those chips from Taiwan. And they are playing in the middle of the petro yuan and the petrodollar. And America is depleting its oil reserves whilst China's got the largest oil reserves in the world. Who controls the price of oil? Trump needs oil to go down to combat some of its inflation as this happens, as he goes through this fiscal dominant strategy. Trump works for the financial industrial complex. That's how it works. So the military industrial complex, they get to go steal some resources. So is this really going to make America great again? Or is this asset stripping America and burdening it with the debt while the contracts go out to other forces of transnational capital? The debt goes up. The debt needs to roll over. That weakens the dollar. That accentuates the transition to this multinational, world order that we're seeing right now. Now, Saudi can manage a steady decline in the petrodollar, which it has to do because as the dollar weakens, the peg to the currency gets worse. And they're not going to defend it by selling gold. Everyone's selling gold. If you look right now at who's lending and who's buying treasuries, Tether lends more to the US government than Saudi Arabia. They're buying equity. They're not lending it to the US government because nobody wants to own the US treasuries other than America for subsidizing its debt right now at the end of a debt cycle. So Saudi wants to buy more and more equity so it can buy these weapons, it can buy artificial intelligence, it can buy more and more influence, it can partner with the Gulf countries, it can get more and more of these data centers, it can repurpose some of this energy, and you can use the Israeli and US military industrial complex to go get you what you need. Is this really the power that we've been told it is? How does Trump get compensated? Well, I've already told you. He gets the Trump Towers in the Middle East. He's got affinity partners funded by the sovereign wealth funds. He's got Jared Kushner that's managing those funds, which has the Israeli relationships. The elite billionaires are going to be invested in order to hand over many of those assets. So eventually Israel can be privatized and acquired into the Gulf sovereign wealth structure, as will Palestine as well. And so who's actually capable of doing this oil refining of very specific type of hard oil in America? Well, I looked into it. And when we were going through the Middle Nation structures, a company called Motiva Enterprise LLC pops up. And who's Motiva Enterprise LLC owned by? It's owned by Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco was a part of a company that is 97% owned by the Gulf Sovereign Wealth Funds and Gulf Power. Only 3% of the float is out there. And it owns 100% of this company. And they own Port Arthur, which is a refinery in Texas. Do you reckon the Port Arthur refinery in Texas might end up getting the contract when Exxon says it can only be done at $80? This is heavy crude oil that needs massive infrastructure investment and capacity. Do you really think that this is America in charge of its own national security, or it is fully subordinate to the financial industrial complex? And it is dumping the debt on the average American who's going to end up paying the bill. So the stock owners receive the value, the national debt increases. People think that this is propping up the petrodollar, but it didn't. The DXY didn't get above. Silver went up further. It crashed further to silver. In fact, it crashed further to gold, and it even crashed further to Bitcoin. Bitcoin turns around and it strengthens against the dollar. I think this is clear what's really happening here. Nothing stops this train. This is the new multipolar world order. And we even get Rubio come out and say it. We get everyone coming out and saying it. What you used to call me a conspiracy theorist for 2 years ago, I think I'm just following the money. And so this is the real power and the real power structure. It's obvious because it's not interest. There is no nationalistic agenda of the country. So who's calling the shots here? Well, it's the FIC, it's the MIC, it's the TIC, it's the US, it's China, it's Russia, and it's the Gulf countries. And they've already decided what's happening. And we're getting a theater that makes it look like there's something else happening. Now, you may call me an absolute conspiracy theorist, but let's look at the Iran operation, which will be the final operation, and we'll predict what happened, even though throughout all these episodes, I've been telling you and sharing with you what may happen, and everyone has been violently opposing me. During the 12-day war, I was giving live commentary. Everyone thought I was crazy, conspiracy theorist. But that was managed theater, and I recorded it. I've got it all on my blog. I like documenting all of these things because when I get it wrong, I'll admit it, but I'll adjust accordingly because these are complicated things to figure out. But everything seems to be backing up what everyone calls me potentially a conspiracy theorist for. So I want to have a look at Iran. Now, those of you that haven't studied the history, let's have a look at what happened to Iran in the past. So when I tell you what's happening right now, maybe there's a pattern that you can recognize. And if you think that I'm pushing out Iranian propaganda, I've created a little AI video that took declassified CIA documents from 2017 that explained exactly how they did in the past, exactly what's happening right now. And who did it? Mossad, CIA, and MI6. So hopefully we can get the video to play right now. Azad, let's play the second video.
For more than 60 years, the full story.
Yeah, sorry. I want you to look for the patterns of what has been confirmed and see if you recognize it for what's happening right now and see if you got played. Let's play the video.
Was completely buried in classified government files. But then, in 2017, the CIA finally lifted the curtain on an operation that didn't just overthrow a government. It lit a fuse that would smolder for decades and ultimately change the entire Middle East forever. Let's get into how this one secret mission redrew the map of power.
Okay, so when you think about the modern relationship between the US and Iran, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For a lot of us in the West, it's probably one single dramatic event, the Iran hostage crisis. I mean, back in 1979, the world was just glued to the news, watching in shock as headlines like this one took over everything. The US Embassy in Tehran had been overrun, and Americans were being held as prisoners.
And it wasn't short. For 444 agonizing days, 52 Americans were held captive. This whole crisis came to define a U.S. presidency, and it carved out this deep-seated hostility between the two countries that, let's be honest, is still very much alive today.
But here's the thing. Why? Why did this happen? Where did all that intense anger come from? Well, to find the real answer, we can't start in 1979. We have to rewind the clock by almost 3 decades to uncover a story that was hidden for a very long time.
And the reason we have to go back is because, for most of modern history, the real origin of this conflict was literally a state secret. It wasn't until the CIA declassified these files just a few years ago that the world could finally piece together what really went down in Iran back in 1953.
And, like so many conflicts in the 20th century, this one really boils down to a single, incredibly valuable commodity: oil.
So, picture this. It's the early 1950s, and Great Britain basically has a chokehold on Iran's economic lifeline. We're talking about the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And this wasn't just some company, it was running the biggest oil refinery on the planet, making a massive amount of money for Britain. For them, this wasn't just about cash, this was about projecting global power.
So you have to wonder, right, with all this wealth being pumped out of the ground, how much of it actually went to the people of Iran? Well, the answer is shocking. Iran was getting less than 20% of the profits from its own natural resources.
And to really put this into perspective, just look at the comparison here. Right next door, the Americans had a 50-50 profit-sharing deal with Saudi Arabia. Seems fair, right? Well, when Iran asked for a similar deal, Britain gave them a hard no. The Iranians weren't even allowed to look at their own books to audit the company.
As you can imagine, the frustration was just boiling over. And out of that simmering anger, the Iranian people went to the polls and democratically elected a man they believed would finally stand up for them: Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. And this guy, Mossadegh, was a really remarkable figure. He was the first Iranian to get a law doctorate from a Western university. He had this reputation for being totally incorruptible. He was even named Time magazine's Man of the Year. He was, at his core, a fierce nationalist who believed Iran's wealth should belong to the Iranian people.
And so, on May 1st, 1951, he did something that the British Empire thought was unthinkable. With huge popular support behind him, Prime Minister Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He declared that Iran's oil now belonged to Iran.
For the people of Iran, this was a massive moment of national pride. But for the British, this was a direct threat, not just to their profits, but to their whole sense of imperial power. And they were determined to get their company back, one way or another. So first, Britain tried to squeeze them with a global oil embargo, which just crushed Iran's economy. But the people didn't budge. They stood by Mossadegh. So then Britain took its case to the UN and the International Court of Justice, and they lost. With their legal options exhausted, they moved to a much darker strategy. Just get rid of Mossadegh.
Now, this is the really crucial part: how they got the United States involved. The British were clever. They knew the Americans didn't care all that much about their oil profits, so they changed the story. They took this economic dispute and brilliantly repackaged it as a Cold War crisis. They painted the democratically elected Mossadegh as a secret communist sympathizer, a domino about to fall to the Soviets. And the new Eisenhower administration completely bought it.
And the joint MI6 CIA plan they cooked up was codenamed Operation Ajax. It was, honestly, a sinister, 4-step playbook for a hostile takeover of a country. Step 1, run a massive propaganda campaign to paint Mossadegh as a communist. Step 2, bring in suitcases full of cash to bribe politicians, military officers, and journalists. Step 3, pay mobs to stage fake riots to create the illusion of chaos. And then, the final step, launch a military coup.
The man they sent in to run this whole show on the ground was a CIA agent named Kermit Roosevelt. And yes, you heard that right, he was the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt. He literally crossed the border from Iraq, carrying suitcases stuffed with cash to get the plan rolling. But here's the twist. The first attempt, on August 16th, was a total disaster. Mossadegh got tipped off. He arrested the plotters, and the Shah of Iran, who was part of the plan, completely panicked and fled the country. For a moment there, it looked like the whole thing had failed. Roosevelt was actually ready to pack up and go home, but his British counterpart from MI6 convinced him to stay and fight. So they doubled down on step 3. They paid mercenaries to pose as Mossadegh's supporters and had them go on a rampage, tearing down statues of the Shah, creating absolute mayhem, all designed to manipulate the narrative for the international media.
Then, just 3 days later, on August 19th, those same paid mobs were back out on the streets, only this time they were chanting pro-Shah slogans. With tanks backing them up, they stormed Mossadegh's home. And just like that, in a matter of hours, Iran's democracy was completely destroyed.
On the surface, the coup was a success. The Shah was put back on his throne, and the Western oil companies got their control back. But in the process of crushing a nation's democracy for profit, the US and the UK had planted the seeds of a very bitter harvest.
And this timeline just lays out the long-term consequences perfectly. The Shah comes back in '53 and rules with an iron fist for the next 26 years. The oil company rebrands itself as British Petroleum. Yep, BP. Mossadegh dies a prisoner in his own home. And then, in 1979, all that anger that had been simmering since 1953 finally boils over into a full-blown revolution, and the Shah flees Iran for good.
So here's the bottom line, the most crucial takeaway. The 1979 Iran hostage crisis did not happen in a vacuum. That deep-seated anti-American sentiment that fueled it was a direct result of the CIA and MI6 betraying Iranian democracy a whole generation earlier.
And that just leaves us with this huge, haunting question, doesn't it? What if they hadn't done it? What if they had just let Iran's democracy be? What would the Middle East look like today? This story isn't just about a single coup. It's a playbook for how economic control is maintained through force and deception. It's a reminder that behind so many global conflicts are battles over resources and financial sovereignty. It forces us to ask, how many of today's crises have their roots in yesterday's secret operations?
How do you feel about what you're being told in the media and social media right now after listening to that? Do you really think that this is a conspiracy theory? Or do you think that we've all been played and that you're a useful idiot in a game that is causing death and destruction for the average people? That's what this does. And we have to be smarter. And we have to decide, are we going to engage how the world really works? The war you're witnessing, I pay quote unquote war, is theater. Because when you follow the money, you know that the whole region has agreed on regional stability. And yet, they're willing to launch a currency war to destroy the savings of the average person. Is it possible? Is it possible? Now, let's go a little bit further. A little bit further. Is it possible that higher factions of power in Iran were kind of helping? And by having enemies with Israel, it was kind of helping the US military industrial complex make a shit ton of money? Is it possible that these different corrupt routes and angles and militia that were protecting and allowing certain drug routes to continue was actually a route that the CIA wanted the drugs to get into America? Is it possible that there could be some cooperation? Why don't we ask, I mean, maybe don't ask me, we'll give a conservative version, AI. Let's ask about a different operation. Hey, have during the 1979 Iranian Revolution, what happened during the Iran-Contra affair?
Absolutely. Let's dive into that a bit. So in a nutshell, this is about Franklin D. Roosevelt during the Great Depression era. He faced a lot of pushback from the Supreme Court on his New Deal policies.
We're not going back to, sorry, I'll try one more time. Could you explain the Iran-Contra affair and whether it turned out that US was funding both Iran and Iraq in the war with each other? And was Iran, after this hostage operation, actually engaging in weapons trafficking for the US government?
Sure. In short, the Iran-Contra affair was a big political scandal in the 1980s. Basically, the US government secretly sold weapons to Iran, even though there was an arms embargo, hoping to free American hostages. Then they secretly used the money from those arms sales to fund the Contras, a rebel group in Nicaragua, even though Congress had banned that funding. When this all came to light in 1986, it caused a huge controversy about the legality of these covert operations.
And was this indirectly leading to Iran-Iraq war, where there were chemical weapons being fired, and was US working with both sides in the Iran-Contra affair and working with Saddam Hussein as an ally in Iraq?
In a nutshell, during the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, the US was indeed supporting Iraq, providing them with intelligence and various forms of aid, even while Iraq was using chemical weapons against Iran. At the same time, the Iran-Contra affair was unfolding, where the US was secretly selling arms to Iran. So yes, the US had a complex role, effectively dealing with both sides in different ways during that period.
Thank you. Conspiracy theory? So look, the world is not as we think it is, and we have to be smarter, and we have to follow the money and understand the truth. So based upon this, what do we think is going to come next? Well, regional stability is what the banks and financial institutions want. Israel is being used as a battering ram at the moment in order to get better terms for the financial industrial complex. Historically, its role was to manufacture consent for destabilizing the region, create death and destruction all around the region, while all the different partners were being played by US proxies, and a narrative was perpetuated that weaponizes religion in order to play emotional turmoil on you. And it's still being done. And we can look at October the 7th. We can look at all these different things. The world is definitely not as it seems. So this theater is designed, what we're witnessing right now, when I follow the money, to execute a regional transition. I think that Khamenei is cooperating with regional powers. There is a power dynamic that has been achieved. The proxies were used in order to have destabilization campaigns so that the Middle East can never unify around its oil and enforce the dollar on the world. And because the Gulf countries have paid and financially incentivized Trump, we're moving to a regional stability, all because China was able to create some de-dollarization, and America is retreating into a regional power based upon the new economic and projecting power, while they rent out their army and burden the American people with all of the debt. All major players collectively have probably decided that they're going to avoid a real war, and this theater is the way of manufacturing a transition without losing the narrative that can lead to the civil unrest. And because America has been funding all of these militias and terrorist groups and various other things and using them in order to destabilize the region, just as they are in Africa right now. This is Western powers extracting resources through violence, death, destruction, genocide, settler colonialism, and extraction of resources, while you're told that something completely different is happening because they have control over the media narrative as well. I think this is what the outcome will be. I think Iran is dropping the proxies. It is strategically weakened, as is Israel, which has been burdened with debt at the moment. And if it needs to go through another tick for tack, the result will be the same. What was the result of the 12-day war? America pretended that it took out the nuclear energy program after 20, 30 years of saying that they're about a second away from a nuke and they're going to fire it in America and Israel. And then therefore all this craziness. Israel got to say that we took out the nuclear program and we protected ourselves. Iran got to say, look, for the first time, we took out areas of Israel, and America didn't react other than taking out the nuclear program. All three narratives were acceptable. Israel was burdened with additional debt, more assets got stripped, more deals were being negotiated into the financial industrial complex, and Iran conducted internal regime change and allowed various proxies to be taken out. As long as they continue to take out and allow decapitation or integration of other proxies that gave them negotiation power in the past. That's what's happening. And so it's likely that Iran has dropped all the proxies, and that's why we're witnessing this right now. And there are members of the IRGC that wouldn't be on board this. And Israel right now is going into Lebanon, and Lebanon's saying that the Lebanese government, which was burdened with IMF debt, where they stole all the people's money, and Israel destroyed all the banks so that they could have their gold-backed Islamic loans against their assets, and created massive currency wars, destruction of all the value, destroyed all the people's savings through a covert currency war, that they now have a government that's subordinate and saying that they're taking out the Hezbollah proxies. They're no longer supported. And so we're going to see operations that drive everything to the fact that the proxies have served their purpose right now. Some of them won't be on board. Some of them will integrate. BRICS is probably going to be offsetting the sanctions that causes the economic destruction in Iran right now. And they can create their alternative de-dollarization routes that economically allows them to thrive and allows the oil to continually, and we will get a slow transition that is allowed to happen based upon oil flowing. China gets the discount, and China has a way of stabilizing the region based upon its vast oil reserves. While we transition to this world of ginormous energy demand as a result of artificial intelligence and robotics, that's going to be replacing as many jobs within America and China. And what is happening within China, China gets to reinvest its money into its people because its bank is not privatized and owned by global finance. Whereas America, the bank is owned by private banks, and they care about their 3-month cycle and their shareholders and global cooperation, which is why the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and it's being completely asset stripped for everything that it can. I don't believe there is going to be a regime change, a dramatical thing like we saw. If there is, then Khamenei would have negotiated just like I believe Maduro would have negotiated and Assad would have negotiated. But personally, I don't think it's palatable because the optics of Iran is that it is an independent country that has to cooperate. So it would be integrated into GCC rails and BRICS rails, led by the fact that China controls the economy. It will be given more and more autonomy. And this is the real 4D chess. This is a 100-year game that China's been playing as a result of the very type of operations like the Opium Wars, where HSBC was created as a bank so the British Empire could steal all Chinese silver and create opium wars and then get it into war with Japan while it did all sorts of embargoes leading to the order that we ended up, a century of humiliation. They put together a century plan. And so is there going to be an uprising in China when we're told that they're oppressed? Well, every single Chinese person, 95 to 99% of them own real estate. And the only reason the economy is suffering right now is because they've all got savings, and they're deciding that when the real estate price goes down, they'll keep their savings. It's not like they're burdened with debt and there's a debt-based Ponzi scheme where the debt has to roll over like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank. And so the Gulf and Iran energy corridor will likely be established. And that will create a lot of energy. And there will be more investment in infrastructure that can solve the water issues. And they won't have this agitating military-industrial complex proxy that creates death and destruction all around the region while pretending it's got something to do with Judaism, which is a narrative in order to recruit an army so useful idiots can be weaponized based upon their belief that the Messiah is being returned and they're saving the people while they justify the ethnic cleansing, death, and destruction of the mafia that actually controls them, called the military-industrial complex. Gas pipelines will probably be unblocked in the time ahead. And dollar will be bypassed through these corridors and this de-dollarization. Now, no one wants to wipe out the dollar and create a hyperinflationary cycle, because they are managing a transition with the financial industrial complex, and the dollar can be utilized for the banks and financial institutions and BlackRock to end up with all the assets, extract as much assets. And there's no America first agenda. There's no Britain first agenda. There's no European first agenda. They are just assets to roll over debt in a devaluing currency, where it's being asset stripped, and civil unrest is the only solution, which is why they're building out this surveillance state and why all this technology is being implemented and why BlackRock is going to take over Federal Reserve policy while it gets its top seat at the World Economic Forum, while Trump ushers in this multipolar world order pretending it's MAGA. The financial industrial complex will not attack the currency. It is a slow depression so that you don't see what's happening. And the only way to opt out is to understand that your wage is going to be growing at a smaller rate than the asset price inflation, and you're going to be left with the bill. And you have to invest in the assets to escape that cycle, because it's a slow depletion of the savings, and it's a slow currency war on top of the fast currency wars and the 5 currency wars that I covered in part 1. Eventually, the justification for Israel to become, to be useful will just be erased. They've got work to do with Lebanon, work to do with Syria, but eventually the financial industrial complex won't need them, and therefore the agitation will end. And we'll probably find out that nuclear program was controlled through rails between technology in America after the military-industrial complex assassinated JFK, because he tried to take on the mafia of the military-industrial complex, MI6, Mossad, and CIA. Normalization will be signed, and there'll be a theatrical event. Trump probably gets his Nobel Peace Prize, but remember who did it. Trump was the front man for asset stripping the country. It's got nothing to do with Trump. Because politicians don't matter, your vote doesn't matter. They are installed, and it's money that matters. This whole thing of a democracy is a pay-to-play system. And that's it. So an agreement will be signed. And that's the purpose of the whole theater that's framed as a war that's about to... You're meant to believe that you're overthrowing Iran. And what are you doing? You're useful idiots for destroying the savings of the average Iranian person. And it's only the ones that are messaging me saying they had Bitcoin in self-custody that are able to protect their family, while the media rails and Elon Musk engages in covert regime change, and spaces are pushing out, there's 20,000 civilians being killed right now. How can you possibly know that? Look at the CIA declassified documents. Look what they did in the past. Are you seeing the same thing? Enjoy the show. Don't be a useful idiot anymore. The people don't create the revolution. They have to actually have the armed forces. And if you look at that, the army that joins the people in the revolution are the ones that lead to regime changes. The regime change happens because the global powers actually coordinated to make it happen. That's what happened in Syria. That was the difference between the destabilization campaign, where Western proxies, ISIS, destroyed the country, destroyed historical monuments, destroyed in the Holy Land. The people that died as a result of that to prop up the dollar. That's why people in Dollar Liberation Day are excited about liberating the world from the dollar, because the dollar is a debt-based Ponzi scheme that ain't helping the average American, and it's been a force of death and destruction while being framed as a force for peace globally. What you witnessed in Palestine is not the exception. You just saw it on 4K video for the first time. And why did they allow you to see it at the first time? Because they allowed October the 7th to happen, because this was about managing a transition and you were meant to see it. But that's what backs the dollar. And you're told that this is some kind of ethical supremacy or superiority or civilizing the world. The world will work better under multipolarity. And the funny thing is, the opt-out and the boycott, Bitcoin, they're trying to centralize as much of it. And they're using your celebrity heroes, Michael Saylor and Larry Fink, and to centralize as much Bitcoin as possible. So now they'll benefit from Bitcoin as well, which is why I don't think it has the ability to take down the system. But you get to boycott the system. The more Bitcoin that you hold in self-custody, the less in the Federal Reserve System, the less power you give them. The more that's held in self-custody rather than an ETF, the more you get to not be a part of the blood money of BlackRock's managed portfolio. The more you don't put it in custody and borrow against it, the less fiat currency you mind, backed by death, destruction, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and resource extraction and piracy, as we're seeing right now. The more that you don't invest in the S&P and you invest in local businesses, maybe decentralized technology, maybe you start looking at your local investments to build your community rather than a global network of power, the more you get to boycott this global network. The more you decide what you're going to spend on and you look at local communities, the more you look at your personal finances rather than engaging in the theater of left and right, Labor, Conservative, Republicans, Democrat bullshit, when all of it was a pay-to-play system and a narrative to distract you from where real power lies. You vote with your money. And so the more that you actually disengage from that theater, disengage from the propaganda, recognize what the algorithm is trying to do. They're trying to galvanize you into a tribe so that you can be part of a divide and conquer civil unrest campaign to usher in a 1984 Orwellian nightmare. The more you can resist against that, use decentralized social media. Eventually, we're going to have to start using all of that. Create different types of rails or invest in different rails. You're never going to get it perfect. Would I use ChatGPT on an iPhone? Yes. Would I rather not? Absolutely. But all I can do is get better rather than perfection. Because if we don't, all we can do is better every week, better every month. Start looking at how you're spending your money. Start thinking about that. And it just so happens that when you spend your money out of line with this agenda, it's probably the very same things that you should be doing. Not vaccinating yourself, not falling for soya, very unhealthy forms of food, injecting yourself with poisons. Why? Because the lobbies control the universities. The lobby control what research gets published. It's all about redirecting, rolling over the Ponzi scheme, and getting you addicted to drugs, getting you addicted to pornography, getting you prostitutes on OnlyFans, getting you mentally scarred, getting you tribalized. And that's what you need to resist. So we need to be strong. We need to be healthy. We need to be sovereign. We need to be resistant. We need to understand what's happening with the psyops. And if any of this information gets through, then please help as many people. We'll create shorter versions through AI. We'll push it on blogs. We'll make it where you can download it bit by bit on Apple and Spotify. We'll back it up on SimonDixon.com in case they take us down. If YouTube decides that you're not allowed the message, we'll put it on Rumble. Yeah, would I rather be doing it on decentralized platforms? We'll put it on Nostr too. We'll do all we can, but we've got to do it all together, because the world that you know right now will not be recognizable in the next 5 to 10 years. And they want you to believe that there is a political solution. There is not a political solution. There is a monetary solution. And you need to be looking after yourself, your family, your community, and making sure they're equipped with the type of information that they need in order to see through this. I know it's overwhelming. I know it's crazy. But as long as I can talk, I'll keep giving this content. And if you enjoyed this, please leave a comment for me to read. Please like, please share. There'll be an X version. You can follow me on X, and I'll give real-time updates as I see them in real time. And please do subscribe to the channel. I'm trying to get to 121,000 subscribers. Thanks to everybody that had me on their podcast. We had one of the interviews I did with Peter McCormack. I think it's got over 240,000 views at the time right now. And it's the top 10 video of over 1,000 videos. That shows that people are hungry for this type of information. And I'll share it with anybody, as big a platform as possible, so we can get as much information out there, because we don't have freedom of reach. We do have a level of freedom of speech, but we know we're building our algorithms. And so I know that this was a massively long mega episode. I'll break it down into parts. Hopefully you consume it bit by bit, download it on your podcast. But always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. There is a black pill, but once you get past the black pill, you realize there's a white pill, an orange pill, and only a few people will be on that right side. I want to make sure you're on the right side of that change so that you can help more people that are just not receptive to understanding the games that are being played. There's been a multi-decade indoctrination exercise of psyops and mind control to show you a version of reality that is so far from reality. But multipolarity, I believe competition will produce a better outcome, and there will be history rewritten, and it will really be an identity crisis for many people. But all that matters is a commitment to truth, serve humanity, fight oppression, and recognize we're all being placed into boxes to divide and conquer. So let's not fall for that. And I hope you enjoyed this new rebranding of Simon Dixon Hard Talk. And let me know what you think about this new direction. And let's do this with peace, love, and unity. And hopefully I'll see you next week, where we'll do this week in Bitcoin and tech, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. Peace.